Again, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining this webinar about fraud. My name is Richard Rajamogan, and I'll be your webinar host today. I'm a consultant with Gate One, and I've got 19 years of experience in industry and transformation consulting across financial services and healthcare. And for those of you that do not know Gate One, we are a digital and business transformation consultancy focused on delivering meaningful change for our clients. This will be the first in a series of webinars from Gate One covering the hot topics in financial services, so please look out for our future events. You can access our webinar recordings on the website at gateoneconsulting.com. If you do have any questions that you'd like to ask, we do have the Q&A open, so please do post your questions in the chat and we'll look to address these during the final part of the discussion. The discussion will be recorded and published on our website, and we're aiming for about 30 minutes with a bit of time at the end for Q&A, just to give you an idea about timings. So with that housekeeping out the way, let's get started. Today I'm really delighted that we have Ashley Hart as our guest. Ashley is the head of fraud at TSB Bank, as well as a board member at CIFATS, who are a not-for-profit fraud prevention service representing public, private and voluntary sectors. He's a non-exec director at Stop Scams UK, an industry-led collaboration including comms, financial services and technology sectors. And he also writes an informative and entertaining money column for Britain's most read newspaper, The Sun. So it's safe to say our topic today holds some interest for him. A very warm welcome to you, Ashley. Thanks for joining.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So I think a great place to start today's discussion is to talk about the fraud landscape. Fraud over the last few years has really moved into prominence as like a big challenge for organizations, particularly in financial services and tech. So I think it would be really helpful if you could outline who the key players are on both sides of this fraud problem, and in particular, who are the most vulnerable people in this problem.
Yeah, okay, good. A good place to start. So fraud is an enormous crime, right? It's the most prevalent crime in the UK. And it's not just the UK, it's international as well. And there are certain markets that continue to be relentlessly attacked by fraudsters. The UK is sort of chief among them, which is unfortunate for us working in counter fraud here, but we're not far behind in North American markets and also in Singapore, for example. There are some parts of the world that seem less affected. So continental Europe doesn't quite see the volume of transactional fraud that we see here. But like all crime, it tends to spread. There are lots of stats around how big of an issue it is, but the thing for me is, despite all the headline numbers, despite the huge losses that are reported on almost daily by media outlets, actually fraud is probably one of the most underreported crimes in the UK, and it's very hard to prove a negative, as they say, but we reckon that only 25% or so is reported, and that, I think that's for a number of reasons, and vulnerability, which you've touched on, is one of those. But vulnerability is a difficult word for financial services because it has quite a tightly defined meaning in the context of regulation. So yes, of course, people who are, according to regulation, defined as vulnerable can be targeted by fraudsters, often are, and they can be specifically targeted because of the factors that make them vulnerable. But if you think about fraud as a crime, which of course it is, then people who fall for it are victims. And any victim of any crime is arguably vulnerable, right? At least for a period of time. So they may have an element of transient vulnerability, and that may be relatively short-lived. It might just be in that moment of realization you think, you know, I've lost 20 quid that I couldn't really afford to lose, or it could be your whole life savings gone, and it could have a profound impact on your mental health, and that could be long lasting. So you could become vulnerable as a result of fraud. But rather than vulnerability, we tend to think about things in terms of susceptibility, because it sort of takes you away from that regulatory definition, and it takes you out of the sort of the siloed thinking that we used to have, which is you had to be vulnerable in order to fall victim to fraud. But actually it's everyone. And we see a huge spike in 18 to 30s, which are not your traditional vulnerability factors, right? Because age is often seen as one of them. Mm-hmm. So yes, of course, we see retirees losing pension funds, but we also see people losing their student loans. We see everything. And I think it's probably fair to say that there is no longer any demographic or profession even that is more susceptible to fraud than others. And I don't know why, but my teams are still often surprised when we see lawyers, accountants, even fraud professionals falling victim to fraud. So I think, short answer to your question is that everyone is susceptible to fraud.
And that's interesting that you say it is underreported, or widely regarded as being underreported, yet is the most reported crime in the UK at the moment. 4.5 million, just under 4.5 million people, sort of incidents reported in the last year. And the demographic is, a fairly youthful demographic that, presumably are reporting these. So, we're going to touch on, customer experience and stuff later on in this discussion, but clearly there is a lot of work to be done around how to engage the people, that cohort of people that aren't actually reporting this, and why they're not reporting it, and enabling them to report, I guess.
It's really important, and it's important for a few reasons. One, because you have to address the root cause of the underreporting, and I'm sure that there are elements of laziness to an extent. If you've lost £5 on a card and your bank very quickly refunds you, do you necessarily see the need to go on and report? And I think there's an argument for banks. TSB does it. I'd like to see all banks do it, to report all instances of fraud. I mean, it's not challenging for a bank to do that, but I think it's important that it would negate that, that laziness or effort part on the point of the consumer or the victim. But actually, the more fundamental reason why it's essential to increase reporting is because government is logically going to assign the amount of resources that a problem apparently needs. So there's not an infinite supply of policing in this country. There's certainly not an infinite supply of money. So if fraud is chronically underreported, it's not hard, is it, to see why there is a matching level of resource to what is perceived to not be a crime at the volume we all know that it is. So reporting is essential because it gives us more intel, but there is more we can do to tackle the problem, and it also gives us a much better platform to stand on to argue for more resources from government, law enforcement, etc., as well as private.
And in terms of the sort of the reporting side of things, obviously the more it's reported on both sides, whoever's doing the reporting, whoever's receiving the reporting, it leads to a greater understanding of the problem and of the stakeholders. You obviously are head of fraud for a bank, and fraud is a very, very, very big problem for most banks. In terms of other sectors and other businesses and in other industries, how is there a benefit to putting resources in to make sure they have a greater understanding of the stakeholders that are at play here? What are the benefits for organizations to sort of go ahead and actually commit to doing stuff about this?
Well, I think it is an easy thing to say, but fraud does impact, everyone, and it impacts us as employees. No matter which sector we're in, we're going to be targeted. But we continually see advances in the way that fraudsters target businesses that are non-financial in nature, and that's historically been seen in insider fraud, for example, where you might have accounting irregularities, false expense claims, dodgy procurement, and you can see it everywhere. But fraud is also, it's becoming a bigger game for organised crime groups. And what we know about OCGs is that they are, well, one, they're relentless and they're well resourced, but they're also very inventive. And we see continually them targeting different parts of the ecosystem when it comes to fraud. So if you are, for example, a telco, you will have fraudsters targeting your employees constantly. And you may have insiders as well. And unfortunately, we see many examples of that. But they're targeting telcos because it's an enabler for them to get into the bank accounts of their ultimate victims. And that's true of every business. I mean, they'll target small businesses relentlessly, either directly with invoice fraud or even for data reasons, to try and extract customer data to use to target customers. So, and the thing that we probably all need to remember is, one, we're all targets, and most of us are employees of one type of business or another. But two, we share a lot of customers. So, you're not just a customer of a financial institution. You shop somewhere, you spend money at retailers, on leisure, etc. Then we're all shared in this. We all share our customers. So any weak link in that chain will be exploited. And it's important that businesses protect themselves, because they may not see the direct loss. They may not be the ones providing reimbursement to their customer, but they will see a real hit for reputation. And that's especially true in businesses when there's a data breach. Customers just don't trust them again, and small businesses in particular. But look, we've seen Ticketmaster, we've seen BA, we've seen huge examples of international companies be targeted and have data breaches that are ultimately for the purposes of facilitating fraud. Those companies take big hits to their reputation. So understanding the problem and the vulnerabilities that they have is vital to keep their customers content and trusting.
Yeah, very important, and it's something that, again, we can touch on the work that Stop Scams and CIFAS are doing, and how they're trying to enable businesses to work together, collaborate, and get this kind of sharing of knowledge and information going. But you mentioned customers, and I think it's a really important aspect of just business in general, in terms of banking, in terms of any industry, customer experience, and that being a differentiator for most businesses in competition with their competitors. We know that in financial services, there's increasing competition from digital first competitors, and they kind of rely on their digital first aspect to provide a superior customer experience. So obviously getting the trade-off right between cost and customer experience, and in particular in banks, it's not just operational cost, it's fraud, losses as well that need to be taken into account. There are all these trade-offs there. Therefore, understanding the kind of the fraud victims in inverted commas journey is essential to understanding how to deliver good customer experience. At TSB, we know that you delivered the fraud refund guarantee, and for anyone that is not familiar with this is something that guarantees innocent victims of fraud, the bank will refund their losses to them. Could you outline to us what impact this has had, firstly on your customers, and secondly what impact it's had on the bank? Because obviously, if you're another bank, or if you're another business who would try to implement such a scheme, you'd be worried about the cost benefit profile to doing something like this. So it'd be really interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think we can cover that off without sharing any state secrets. So first of all, yes, the refund guarantee does on the face of it cost money, because a bank will find itself, TSB finds itself refunding customers or victims, in as the case may be, in circumstances when technically, legally, and in a regulatory sense, they could refuse to do that. I'm not required by rule to refund all of the customers that I do refund. And I do it for a couple of reasons. One is about that trust point that you mentioned. I mean, customers have an increasingly greater ability to move banks. We can shop anywhere, we can bank anywhere, and the current account switching service, for example, makes it very easy to move your bank. And given that fraud is as prevalent as it is, I want my customers to feel and be more protected than at any other bank, because it's increasingly on people's minds. And traditionally we don't compete on fraud. It's not a thing. I don't go out and say you're going to be a victim of fraud somewhere else more than you are here, so come and bank with TSB. That's not the message. The message is, look, it could happen to anyone at any time, wherever you bank, right? What I think is important that as a TSB customer is, if it does happen to you here, you're covered by the refund guarantee. And that sense of confidence and security is really important, especially with the demographic of customers that we have that really value that. And that's been really evident as we've gone through the pandemic. People have had to switch to digital services or telephony more than they have in the past. We have a big set of customers that rely on our branch network, and yes, we've stayed open and we've been there for them, but their confidence in going out and interacting with our branch partners has been reduced. So they've had to bank online, and you often find confidence is a big blocker in digital adoption, and fear of fraud is one of those things that drives a lack of confidence. So being able to give that to customers is vital, right? It increases the way people feel about TSB. It makes them feel better, makes them feel more confident. That's really important for us, and that's one of the things we offer. But you're right, this on the face of it comes with a cost, but actually that cost is significantly lower than you might think it is as an independent observer. And the reason for that is that customers learn a lot more from us and the education we can provide when they're more honest about how a fraud has taken place, and they're more honest about how a fraud was taking place if they know they're going to get a refund, even if they admit to having clicked a link they shouldn't have done. So I'll give you an example of how that works. I mean, before the guarantee, a customer would ring, and traditionally they'd say, I've lost money, I don't recognize these transactions. So logical question, well, did you click on a link in a phishing email? Did you get any suspicious phone calls? And the answer would genuinely be, I don't know, I don't remember, I didn't do anything wrong. And that's just because they are very much concerned about the refund. They've lost potentially a life-changing sum of money, and they can't see past that. So their memory becomes less accurate, shall we say, than it might otherwise be. The first question now is, I think I've done something silly. Am I covered by the guarantee? Yes, you are covered by the guarantee. Right, well, here's the link that I clicked on in the email that I got, and it took me to this page, and here's the information I gave up. So a much greater degree of intelligence that we can gain from our customers, which means two things. One, I can much more quickly get that domain name taken down, so I can prevent other people becoming victim, many of whom would inevitably have been on my book, and therefore losses I would have had to have borne. But also I can say to that customer, right, this is how it happened to you. This is how you lost the money. Thank you for sharing all this, because this is how you spot it next time. And interestingly, we've seen that translate into data. Our repeat victim rate has reduced significantly month on month since we've had the guarantee. And that, these repeat victims are not only costing the bank more and more money, but their confidence in TSB and banking would just be plummeting if they were victimized repeatedly. So the cost is defrayed by a reduction in repeat victims. And also we know that regulation is increasingly pushing us to refund more and more anyway. It's not the right thing to do by your customer if you refuse a refund at the point of them having become a victim. If you know that, a year and a half down the line, when the Ombudsman Service eventually reviews their case, it gets upheld. I mean, there's a cost in that. There's a case fee. There's 8% interest. About the only place you can get 8% interest nowadays, and that's a massive cost for the bank. And why have that cost and deliver an appalling victim experience when you can just realise that loss up front?
And the cost of the customer for being without that money for an extended period
Absolutely.
of time. And I guess the other point that springs to mind when you mention that is that, if as an organization you are providing an opportunity that encourages people to report fraud, then obviously your unreported number as a percentage of your reported declines, and therefore we overall as a whole system we get a better idea of exactly what we're dealing with in terms of numbers, in terms of scale, in terms of type, etc., etc. So the other question I had around this was, why should other organizations adopt an approach like this? Would you recommend organizations to adopt an approach like this?
I don't have the benefit of looking at the prevention measures and the numbers in every other institution. I can certainly say that based on our experience, it's the right thing to do. It leads to much better customer advocacy and outcomes. And frankly, you learn a lot more and you can evolve your fraud prevention systems much, much, much faster than historically we've been able to do. So do I think it's the right thing to do? Yes. Would I like to see other banks do it? I would like to see it, because I think we should all provide a better service for victims of crime. And we've talked about how prevalent fraud is, and we know how sophisticated it's become. We know how often it's an OCG behind it. So, I mean, you've got one individual up against an army of fraudsters, right? The ability for a customer to defend themselves is significantly lower than historically it's been. So yes, I'd like to see others do it. Frankly, I think we're going to find regulation will drive us there as a sector anyway. And obviously, personally, I think that's a good thing. I think that's a right thing, because I think it focuses minds on prevention. And the sad truth is, in a business and in a bank in particular, you always have to fight for investment. And peers and other organisations listening to this will no doubt recognise going to investment committees in their various firms saying, I need £1 million because I need to tighten up my fraud defences. And they'll be up against people saying, I can make £5 million for the bank with this product. And there's only so much money to invest, and there's only so many slots in a development and deployment cycle. If you are directly saving the bank money, because otherwise you would refund it, by investing in fraud defences, that business case is much more likely to pass. As it stands, in organisations that don't refund everyone, it's a subset you're refunding. So the benefits case is a subset, and it's much harder to get to a place where everyone is more protected, which is obviously the right answer. So I think there are lots of benefits to it. And yes, I'd like to see people follow, but it's for individual banks to make their own decisions based on, what they know about their book and their risks. A couple of things that I definitely would like to see, though, and I make no apology for the fact that a lot of industry doesn't agree with me on this point, is I want to see banks publish their refund rates. And many industry commentators have said, well, it's only part of the story. Well, yes, it's part of the story, but it's a very important one. People who may become victim, I think they have a right to know how their bank will treat them in the event that they do fall victim. And we have to publish very proudly on our websites and on the doors of all of our branches what our telephony service is like, what experience you might get in a branch, even though you may never use those things and you may only use a mobile app. Well, this is just another piece of the puzzle. And yes, it's one, but I think it's an important one that should be published. So I absolutely think everyone should be doing that. And I also think, and we touched on this earlier, that every financial institution should be obliged to report all cases of fraud. it's not particularly hard to do, and it increases that intelligence picture. Pushing it back onto individual customers and victims to report, we'll see a logical dropout because customers will have already reported to the bank. They don't really want to do it twice. Even if they've got the time, there isn't always an appetite there. But also, they haven't got the knowledge that we have. Our systems will have picked up so much about that fraud and how it happened that the customer won't know. So the quality of a report to law enforcement from a financial institution will be higher in an intelligence sense as well. So yes, I'd like to see everyone refund their victims, but I accept that different businesses have different risk appetites, but I don't really see a defense to the argument that everyone should report and publish the way they've treated victims.
Yeah. I don't think anyone can sort of put up much of a strong argument against that. I mean, the overall benefit is a good one for the whole system. You mentioned the importance of getting the information back into our systems so that our systems are better informed and therefore work more efficiently in terms of preventing and detecting fraud. And in the work that I've done with some of my banking clients, systems has always been a big issue. With any bank, particularly because you have large organizations that have got legacy systems and new systems and putting them all together. Now, the latest and greatest systems claim to have great benefits and can prevent fraud and detect fraud really well, but is that necessarily the most important thing to have, the best systems, or is there something else that organizations can do with their current systems to improve the performance and the overall performance of their prevention and detection?
But I'm as cynical as most, probably, when I'm looking at the likely outcome of buying something. Signing up is all really very impressive. However, I think broadly speaking, it is true that a new system is likely to achieve more than a legacy system because it has more modern tech and it's being tuned in a way that will respond more accurately to the current threats that we face. So yes, I think on the face of it, new tech is probably better than old tech, and anyone running a slow old laptop compared to their colleague running a shiny new one is probably going to have the same feeling, right? It scales up. However, it's not the be all and end all. And you mentioned legacy systems. The cost of removing legacy systems can be utterly prohibitive to investing in new ones. So you're not just saying I need to go and spend a couple of million quid on a shiny new product. You could be spending 3 times that, taking the old one out and doing the plumbing. And when you add those things together, back to the cost benefit argument we have at our investment committees all over the industry, that can be a really tough sell. So I think what we're seeing across industry now is that some of these new vendors who are less product designers and more data science analytical people who are providing incredible modeling to prevent and detect fraud, what we're seeing is they are starting to sell their models, their expertise, in a way that can be deployed into legacy systems. So selfishly, I mean, that's the best of both worlds for banking. I can have the latest and greatest minds working on the latest and greatest model, and it will work just fine with my slightly aged tech that I've probably got in the banking sector. So I think we're seeing that as a direction of travel. But there's a huge capability point as well. And any modeler will tell you that what you get out is only as good as what you put in. Mm-hmm. And access to data, transaction information, even application data from a customer who's applied for a current account, and being able to link that to the way they subsequently transact on that account, just extracting that information and being able to decision against it in a fraud sense is equally, if not more important, probably more important than having amazing future style tech, right? If you can't see all the data, you can't do anything with the new tech. So analytical skill sets are mandatory, I think, in every fraud function. But an investment in data science capabilities, data mining tools, these things are equally, if not more important than convincing your IT team to go and buy you the latest shiny gadget, frankly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was going to mention the capability point, but you mentioned it there pretty naturally. My point was going to be, are we going to see a greater need? If fraud is underreported and more fraud is becoming more sophisticated, then the need for kind of a hardcore sort of data science analytical capability in-house in banks or in other organizations is going to become more of a need going forward. So I'm glad you mentioned that. So I think we've got the systems part, but are there any kind of non-systems based measures that not just banks but any other organizations should be thinking about taking to make sure that they are doing their bit to detect and prevent and therefore manage their customer risk and also their organization risk?
Yeah, and you've mentioned a couple of organisations that are obviously very close to my heart. CIFAS and Stop Scams are really good examples of what I think is key, which is collaboration across not just our industry but across sectors as well. And CIFAS is doing incredible work with local government, and again, that's a sector that historically has been left out of conversations when it comes to fighting fraud. But back to the data point, right? Most people pay council tax. Some people claim grants and benefits, especially during the pandemic. These things combined with bank information and insurance information and telco information can provide an incredibly rich data set for intelligence and to spot the crimes and to save ultimately taxpayers a lot of money. So CIFAS does great work in this space, and frankly, anyone who is not a member of CIFAS, I think, should probably ask themselves, why that's the case. And yes, I have a vested interest, obviously. However, I see directly the benefit that it brings to TSB and to other players across multiple sectors. So I mean, that's sort of much as I can say about CIFAS. If you're not in it, why? Stop Scams is slightly different. Stop Scams is really focusing on collaborations between telcos, banks, and the tech sector, and huge success in landing Google as a member of Stop Scams. Because if you think about the journey of a fraud now, it's not someone knocking on your door, taking your card and your PIN number and going to the cash point. These things now typically take place over multiple platforms, from social media to search engines. They can involve remote access software. They involve literally everything from phones to text messages to emails to search to bank systems. So you can't look at a silo approach anymore. You have to look at how you can work across multiple industries. And Stop Scams is all about bringing those industries together, and it's doing a great job of that and to start the dialogue. But it also focuses on specific technical collaboration, so absolutely definable use cases where all three sectors can contribute and more fraud can be stopped as a result. So I'm really excited by Stop Scams. I mean, it's backed by the FCA and Ofcom, and fantastic to see those regulators so close to it, because that tells you the esteem in which it's held. So the collaboration is the answer to your question. You cannot do this alone, and you also have to, I think, consider the moral point. Yes, we join CIFAS and Stop Scams to save our banks money. Of course we do that. That's the point, right? And we can keep more of our customers safe from becoming a victim as well. But actually, I think we have a moral obligation to share the data that we hold on fraudsters and to a certain extent on victims with other institutions to safeguard the customers of those institutions as well. And we've all got friends and family that probably bank with other banks. I don't want to see them become a victim. And it's to no one's benefit to embolden criminals to attack certain parts of a sector. That's not good for anyone. So there's a shared obligation here to collaborate.
Coincidentally or not coincidentally, you've just touched on one of the questions that actually a couple of people have written some questions about collaboration. It must be a fairly obvious kind of point to make, but I'll just read out one of the questions, and and there are points in there that I don't think you addressed, but it'd be good to hear your thoughts on. Do you think more collaboration is needed across industries such as insurers, banking, and comparison sites? So, for instance, the detection of fraud via the online channel, cross-sharing of details such as devices, IP addresses, etc., where fraud has been detected. This would be valuable collaboration and aid in the detection of large fraud rings. And this person has said, they've worked in both industries, and they think that, there is something here that isn't happening at the moment that needs to be worked on. And the second point about collaboration is about how we get social media companies to pull their weight in this fight, because at the moment it seems like that they're not taking as much responsibility as they might be able to, and yet they have a lot of sort of action being generated on their platforms that are the beginning of a lot of the sort of the criminal side of things, their journey. This is where they start.
It's the entry point.
Yeah, absolutely. So how it'd be great if you could say something about this. And also my kind of point of view on this is, how realistic is it? What can we really do as organizations to come together and do this? How do we engage with Stop Scams? How do we engage with CIFAS? And how do we make things actually happen?
So let me say the first point first. So insurance and banking have a natural coexistence in the fraud space, unfortunately. And I'm always impressed by the way insurance contributes to CIFAS. I've been lucky enough to sit on their advisory board with some fantastic insurance reps, and you see the journey. I mean, criminals don't target just banks, but they target people who are mutual customers, often with insurers and telcos, and we all use Money Saving Expert, Money Supermarket, Compare the Market, all this stuff. I mean, these are aggregators that take an astronomical amount of personal information. And yes, they see huge amounts about fraudulent journeys as well. And I think in the question, device information was mentioned, hugely powerful. I mean, fraudsters have to use tech. I mean, they have to be using laptops, iPhones, whatever. If I can get information on a dodgy one of those and quickly share it across industry with a common device identifier, that device becomes worthless. And again, the cost of committing the crime of fraud goes up, which means hopefully they'll be diverted from it. I mean, that's the goal, right? So yeah, collaboration with insurance is really important. By no means the only sector. Telcos are particularly close to a lot of the fraud journeys as well. So yeah, collaboration is key. Do we need to do more? Yes. And I think the answer to that question is never going to be no. But there are bodies that do it, and CIFAS is particularly strong when it comes to sharing data between sectors like insurance and telcos and banks. So yeah, the more the merrier when it comes to collaboration. Social media, so we see stats now where over 50% scams originate on social media, and it's just impossible to sustain that. I don't think there is an industry on earth that can sustain a defense against the amount of pressure that's being put on tech and social media in particular to do something about this problem. I, like many others, am left somewhat cold by the online harms, online safety bill. It's weak. Yes, it covers user-generated content, and I am very keen to see how social media responds to, ultimately the bill and the codes that will go along with it. And I'd love to see them taking down the dodgy posts about fantastic investment in crypto and all these other things that will lead to massive losses. But frankly, it doesn't go far enough. It doesn't cover paid for advertising as it stands. And you see an enormous amount of investment fraud from really good looking adverts that, because they are sponsored or have ad next to them, that actually lends a sense of credibility to them. So you're actually not tackling one of the biggest problems. So yes, more needs to be done. I'm pleased to see the government is, I'll say, dipping its toe in the water of what needs to be done. It's not doing enough. It's not doing it quickly enough. But it's a good start. But it's not, none of this is insurmountable, right? Tech companies are fantastically good at gathering and sharing data. Is literally why they exist. And there's the saying I often hear, which is, if you're not paying for something, then you're the product, right? You're the commodity. So we all go on Google and think this is great, it's free. Well, that's because you're the money, right? So they've harvested all this data. We can get that in a format they can share it with banks, with other industries. We can all work together to block these fraud journeys. We can spot the weaknesses and we can shut them down. And back to the point around making it too difficult for fraudsters to commit fraud, you do that by shutting down their avenues. And it's just too easy. It's too easy to clone a legitimate investment firm that costs virtually nothing. It takes 10 minutes. Then you can put an advert that will appear right at the top of Google, costs a bit of money, but ultimately not very much. And then you can have a couple of dudes on the phone who sound posh enough to be everyone's preconceived notion of an investment broker, and the money starts pouring in. And then when they do get reported, what's the odds of them being caught and prosecuted? Essentially nil. So low barrier to entry, virtually no cost of being caught, prevented. Is it any wonder that it's such a lucrative game and there are so many gangs in it? Not really. So social media has an essential role to play. It needs to do more. And unfortunately, it's had the chance to do it voluntarily and steadfastly refused. So legislation is coming, right? And long may that continue.
And in terms of, you mentioned the links with justice just then, the collaboration between banks and justice at the moment. I know there is some, and TSB, I know, are one of the banks that does actively collaborate with the justice system. But is there more that can be done there as well?
Yeah, I think this is a tricky one because police resources are limited. Do I think there is sufficient resource dedicated to tackling fraud? No, not even close. But will there ever be? Probably not, because there's just not enough police and money to go around. That's just the nature of things. So what we can do as industries is make more of the resource that we have got. And I see too many examples, as we've touched on a number of times, of just fraud not being reported. Well, we can't sit here and moan about police not doing anything about fraud if we're not reporting it in the first place. I mean, that's a bit ridiculous. So more reporting. Also, better quality reporting. I see too many examples of police officers being forced to go to court to get production orders to come back to a bank to get a limited set of information, just to go back to court to get another production order. Time, effort, money, right? The three things that are going to kill any chance of a successful prosecution. So I think a lot of the time we just need to get on with it, and we need to provide better quality intelligence to police officers. And I haven't met many police officers in my time who don't want to nick criminals. That's mostly why they come to work. So give them the tools they need to do the job and let them get on with it. Should we be funding all of it? No, I don't think we should be funding all of it, but I think we can provide a lot more than just money. Just the data and the insight and the support we can give to law enforcement will yield better resources. But we also have to recognise that fraud's a volume crime, and you can't go after every single money mule. If that was the only crime you prosecuted, we still wouldn't have enough prison space, court space, or anything else. Right? You just can't do it. But in the analogy, it's a really lazy one. I've used it before. But in absence of anything better, I'll do it again. Fraud has to be thought of like speeding in some ways. If you drive your car at 110 miles an hour and hit a school bus, you're probably going to go to prison for a long time, and you bloody well should. If you do 36 in a 30, you're going to get a few points in the ticket, right? Because that's the volume end of the crime that is dealt with in an administrative way, and that's what's missing in fraud. There is no deterrent for being involved at a low level in fraud, because you're never going to get investigated, and if you are, you're never going to get charged, and if you are, you're never going to get anything other than a slap on the wrist. So we need to invent collectively some form of legal deterrent on the volume end as well, because money mules are crucial to every type of fraud. If you can have enough of a disincentive and you can use that enough, then fraud will dry out.
Yeah. See that. That's interesting. The final point that we just touched on there before: how do we engage? Who do we engage with to help the fight, but also to better our organisation's ability to combat this? Is it with Stop Scams and with CIFAS? Those are two organisations. Are there any others? And also, how do you engage? What are the opportunities to engage with these organisations?
Well, look, CIFAS and Stop Scams are both not-for-profit companies who absolutely love hearing from new prospective members. I mean, why wouldn't they, right? So yes, if you're interested, absolutely get in touch, and you'll find that a rewarding experience. But there are also local fraud forums all around the country. The London Fraud Forum is really, really good. There's one in the southwest. I mean, they're all over the country, and there are opportunities for people from different sectors to come together and learn more about fraud. So really good opportunities to learn there. But frankly, I mean, look everywhere and there's an opportunity to get involved in the counter fraud profession. So you can do that through chambers of commerce, you can do the assistance advice. I mean, there are so many avenues. It's the extent of fraud is such that it's negligent to not go and educate yourself and your firm about it. I think that's my view, and there are enough places to go and do that. But absolutely, if you're listening to this and you're wondering why your organisation isn't a member of CIFAS, then you should be. So go and have a conversation, right? I'd be glad to talk to you.
Okay. So we're just about sort of getting to 2021, and I think that's a really great place to close the conversation. Ashley, I'd really like to thank you for giving up your time today. It's been a great discussion. I hope you've enjoyed it. I've certainly enjoyed sort of hearing your insights and knowledge. And of course, thank you to everyone who's attended for coming along today. And I'm hoping that you've gained some great insights about how your organisations and how you as individuals can improve outcomes to your businesses and reduce any kind of fraud-related harm to yourself and to your customers. We'll be sending an email out to everyone who's joined this, who's registered, which will include Gate One's recent fraud reports, which I hope will be interesting. Ashley tells me that it's not bad, so I'm hoping it'll be half decent. I'd just like to signpost out to future Gate One events. As mentioned before, it's the first in a number of different financial services webinars Gate One will be hosting. So we'll post details on our website and LinkedIn. If you'd like to know more, please do get in touch. obviously be delighted to have a conversation with you. So yeah, lastly, just remains to say, I hope you have had a great session, and that you have a great day today. Thank you very much for joining. Bye-bye.